Next, I'd like to look at the big differences in culture. So there are a number of issues here to focus on. The first of these is state security laws and internet censorship, freedom of religion, drugs, and recommendations for how to negotiate the laws in China. So first, the state security laws. These are laws that exist to protect state security, so to keep the country secure, safe, and a lot of that is to do with controlling what is a very, very big country with a very big population. So a lot of the laws that may seem to Western ears to be perhaps somewhat draconian or controlling in some way are there for a reason. I won't seek to justify them in this video, but I will just try to explain them in some way, and hopefully in that way everybody can understand what the laws are, why they're there, and how they might impact you in your life when you're in China. So these state security laws cover things like subversion of the state and attacking the state in any kind of way. And unsurprisingly, they focus on things that might be published or said or shared, or actions that might be taken that would be seen to subvert or attack the Chinese state. And again, unsurprisingly, the powers that the state has are broad-ranging. So there is a very broad array of activities and language and actions that can be interpreted as attacking the state or subverting the state. Why should we be concerned about this? Because naturally, as foreigners, a lot of us coming from the West, from countries like the UK and America and Australia and so on, have an instinct to freely state our opinions without any kind of fear of any kind of negative consequence to that. And I mean, I see and hear a lot of foreigners in Shenzhen who do freely express themselves in this way, and there are no negative consequences, or the negative consequences are limited to a small group of people. But there's one large area where very quickly these things can get out of control and can get out of hand, and that's the internet. So it's very important when we're perhaps stating our opinion or sharing experiences about things that happen to us in China that we consider the internet, and we consider that if we're sharing things online, who are we sharing them with, and what are the possible consequences of sharing them in this way. Now that leads us quite neatly into the next section, which is internet censorship. I'm not sure whether the Chinese government would describe it as internet censorship, but that's how we would understand it in the West, and that's how it's broadly reported from a Western point of view. So I'll use the same phrase here. All of these logos that I've put up here represent companies or things which are blocked by the Great Firewall of China. So Google is very famously blocked, and Google owns Picasa and YouTube, and everyone knows about Facebook as well, but there are maybe a few other things in here that you may have wondered, is it blocked or not? So Dropbox, very handy. I would like to use Dropbox in China, but it's blocked. And Snapchat over here, Amnesty International's website, perhaps not a massive surprise that that's blocked. I put this symbol here for a VPN. I'll just highlight that. VPNs are used by foreigners and locals in order to get around the Great Firewall of China, so get around the restrictions and access a lot of the things that are on this slide here, so things like Google, Facebook and YouTube. And obviously the Chinese government's not very fond of that idea and are keen to stop these VPNs. So if you have a VPN service and it suddenly stops working, then perhaps you can guess why. Perhaps someone has got to that service and has stopped that working. So there's a constant battle going on between VPN providers and the powers within China who are trying to stop them. And actually recently in the news, Apple defended a decision to remove all VPN apps from its app store. So that's going to make it more difficult for people to use VPNs on Apple products in the future. Next, monitoring. So as a result of the blocking of a lot of the services and websites that I just described, there are other services that have grown to fill their place. If we consider WeChat, which, as I've said before, kind of serves the purpose of Facebook and WhatsApp, and now also has payment powers as well. So it's a little bit like Apple Pay in that respect, and allows you to access lots of news subscription services and things like this. It's kind of a one-stop shop for using the internet for many people. And then you've got Weibo, which is China's equivalent of Twitter. Now, WeChat and Weibo have grown to become enormous because there is no Facebook in China and there is no Twitter. So something was able to fill the void. But because these services exist in China and are allowed to exist in China, there are some kind of conditions that go with being allowed to operate in China, and that's monitoring. So several years ago, when Google decided to withdraw from China, it was because the Chinese government wanted to place a lot of restrictions and terms and conditions on Google operating in China. And part of that was the ability to limit what could be accessed through the Google search engine. And that's one of the conditions that other search engines that operate in China have actually accepted. In the case of WeChat and Weibo, they have almost certainly accepted similar restrictions and will also be monitored by the Chinese government. And this means that certain topics will be scanned for, and certain items and articles will be censored, will be removed. Why is this particularly sensitive? Well, it tells you a story about the situation with internet censorship and internet monitoring in China. The situation is that if something is deemed to be particularly sensitive, particularly harming to the state, to the government, it will get shut down. Recently, an essay was released by a WeChat user in Beijing, and he was writing an essay about the current situation in Beijing and how many people are not enjoying their lives there because it's a very crowded city, and the prospects for improvement in their quality of life are very slim. This article was read by several million people, and then it was taken down, and days later the author issued an apology. I don't seek to judge this particular incident, but it shows you how sensitive the state is to any kind of perceived criticism when it goes viral in this way. When it reaches millions of people across the internet in China, there is great sensitivity about that. If it's a story that is shared between a couple of friends, the likelihood is that nothing will come of it. But that's why when you're using the internet in China, you need to consider your audience. Next thing I'd like to point out is WhatsApp. There have recently been reports that WhatsApp has possibly been monitored. There's been some disruption to voice calls and other messaging services through WhatsApp. So this is something that's worth being aware of. I have a lot of success using WeChat to contact my family at home, despite the fact that most of them would normally use WhatsApp. So you could consider either. And there's a further point to make here. When we talk about this monitoring, go back to the story of the user in Beijing posting the negative essay. The government's not monitoring in order to snoop on what's going on in your life, to find out your personal details, anything like this. It's, like I said, it's about identifying those hot topics that create a negative impression of the country and appear to undermine the government, undermine China. And those are the sorts of articles that are going to get censored, are going to get cracked down on. So if you're sharing things with a small group of friends, or if you're talking about something totally unrelated to China, then there really is no need to be worrying about these things. Anyway, we'll come back to this later on. The next thing I'd like to say is to point out is freedom of religion. This is an area which will seem, again, quite dramatically different from what you might be used to in your home country. There are only 5 officially sanctioned religions in China: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. I know what you're thinking. Well, the last 2, that's one religion. In actual fact, there are other forms of Christianity being practiced in China, but these will not be the officially sanctioned and registered forms of Christianity. So it's worth checking, if you're going to a house of worship, whether or not it's officially registered. There is one big church in Shenzhen that I know of, which is the Shenzhen Church in Meilin. I also see Muslims traveling around on a Friday lunchtime, which is a traditional time to go to Friday prayers. So it's clear to me that there are people practicing religion in Shenzhen, and it is accepted. But again, it's one of these areas where there is the ability to share ideas with a large group of people in a short period of time, and as a result, the government is interested in controlling and monitoring that. So how do they do that? What restrictions do they have? So it is illegal to proselytize in public in any way. You will not see people standing up on soapboxes in China. As I've said, it's only the officially sanctioned religions in registered houses of worship where you will be allowed to gather and practice your religion in large groups, and it's only in those settings that proselytizing will be tolerated. Finally, any other kind of gathering to worship would be considered illegal, and you should be wary of that in case you might get involved and not understand the risks associated with essentially underground worship that does take place in China. The last thing is drugs. Some drugs are either tolerated or more legal in the West. So obviously I'm thinking about things like cannabis. So it's important that we highlight the fact that China is in a process of waging a war against drugs. If you think of drugs as a spectrum from cannabis all the way up to heroin, all of these are illegal, while using any of them could lead to some form of punishment. So, for example, cannabis could lead to some form of community rehab. There was a famous case of Jackie Chan's son being caught with a rather large amount of cannabis, I think, and he ended up in some kind of rehab. And if you're, for example, supplying heroin to a large group of people, then it's quite likely that you could be sentenced to death. I don't know of any significant cases of foreigners being sentenced in China. Probably the main reason for that is that foreigners would tend to go to places in Southeast Asia to get drugs and then take them elsewhere, whereas the drugs in China are coming from Southeast Asia in the first place. China's main target really is heroin. There is a fairly large heroin problem because of the proximity to Southeast Asia. It's worth basically taking this into account and realizing that in China, drugs are labeled all in one breath. Drugs are bad. So if heroin is very bad, then all drugs are bad, and if all drugs are bad, then cannabis is bad. So it's worth knowing about that conception here. I've mentioned this with Jackie Chan's punishment recently, and there were recently a couple of circus performers who were found smoking cannabis and ended up in custody. So you can perhaps go online and look up a few of these stories and get a feel for what's acceptable. But in general, my advice is stay away from drugs in China. Recommendations. So I'll go through these one by one. Behave well. if you're a foreigner in China and you're getting drunk on a regular basis or making a fuss about things or getting into fights, getting into quarrels, disputing with people, refusing to pay for things, you're going to draw a lot of attention to yourself and often make it a lot easier for the authorities to make their decision. They may not hang around to work out every last detail of what's going on, and you may not be able to really express yourself. So it's best to try to show deference and try to be polite and well behaved at all times, rather than pushing the limits of people's patience. Going back to the passport issue, carry a passport or carry copies of your passport and your residence permit. If you're showing a good effort to meet with the regulations of China and the laws, and when something untoward happens, or perhaps when the police come to check your registration at your apartment, there will be understanding as long as you're showing that effort to do things the right way. This is another area which is, the same point can be made. Registering at the local police station once you move into your accommodation. Again, check with your specialist what's expected at that particular police station, and make a point of trying to do it as quickly as you can, making a significant effort, showing that you're trying to get things done as quickly as possible, and you're very likely to be met with sympathy. It's worth highlighting at this point that you need to register at the police station whenever you get a new visa, so when you receive your residence permit for the first time, and whenever you move into any accommodation. So in the first month you should expect, well, not the first month, so in the first couple of months you should expect to register at the police twice. The first time will be once you move into your new accommodation, and the second time will be once you've received your residence permit. Next point is have a valid visa. So it kind of goes without saying, if you're going to stay in China for any period of time, you must have a visa. So do not overstay your visa. Once you do that, you could really find yourself in trouble. You could be facing a fine. If somehow you end up in a situation where your visa is about to expire or has already expired, you can seek our help, or you can essentially throw yourself on the mercy of the authorities. In this situation, it's best not to cover up the fact that your visa has expired. It's best to front up to the problem and say, hey, look, I've made a mistake, something went wrong, and now I'm stuck in China and my visa has expired. What can I do about it? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to leave China, you're going to have to go through a border and they're going to notice that your visa has expired. So it's best that you be proactive in that sort of situation. Avoid military areas. This is advice that I've received on many different occasions from many different people. If you see anything that looks grand and military, or perhaps it could be rather unassuming, but there's someone that looks like a soldier, it's best to stay away from it. You really don't want to get involved with anything that has military connections, and it may not be very clearly signed, so you might stumble on it innocently, in which case it's best to just turn around as soon as someone comes out shouting in your face. But the point here is they'll be very suspicious of you if you start approaching a military compound or something like that. They might feel that you have some reason to be spying on them or something like that. It's best that you just avoid anything that looks like that, and don't point your camera at it either. Don't take any pictures or give anybody any impression that you might be You might have bad intentions in that respect. I've said it already, my recommendation would be to stay away from drugs when you're in China. I'd be pretty sure that's a pretty good way to get deported. Getting caught doing any kind of drugs in China. If they're not going to punish you according to the laws in China, then they're probably just going to deport you, cancel your visa, and make it very difficult for you to return to China again. Wildlife and pets. It's worth knowing the laws about these. So, first of all, there are certain animals where it's forbidden for you to take live animals out of the country, or even take certain animal byproducts from those animals out of the country. So be wary of that if you're ever intending to do anything like that, and double check what's acceptable. If you're bringing pets in or taking pets out, there are various rules and regulations that you'll need to check and adhere to make sure that everything is proper, that the animals are inoculated and are available for inspection after you arrive into the country. So again, best check up what the rules are there. This kind of feeds back to the first point of behaving well. Stay polite. Just do what would be acceptable and reasonable in your own country, but also be aware that you've come to another country and it has different rules, it has a different culture, the laws are different here, and you should respect those and accept them because you chose to come here.